Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Lourdes Aleman, and on behalf of the Teaching and Learning Lab, welcome to today's seminar. Thank you so much for coming and being here. The theme of this year's TLL speaker series is called the Holistic Student Experience. And basically, we're aiming to explore many different topics concerning both formal and informal learning, student academic support, and well-being. So we're trying to look at the learning experience of a student from a broad range of perspectives. It is often the case that in education seminars, including our own, we get to hear in depth about a particular topic, a learning principle, a teaching practice, or a type of intervention. What we wanted to take a moment to highlight courses that have thoughtfully implemented multiple learning principles and research-based teaching strategies to see how it can be actually done in practice. So when a course is actually thoughtfully designed and taught, the result is often increased student learning, but these courses can and often do also result in increased student belonging and in more inclusive classroom environments. So for today's seminar, we have invited two of our very own. Dr. Darcy Gordon is an MITx Digital Learning Fellow in the Biology Department, and Professor Jeff Gore in the Physics Department, to give us a glimpse into how they have interweaved multiple evidence-based principles and teaching practices in 705, which is biochemistry, and 8591J, which is systems biology. So this seminar will be focused primarily on application rather than on basic research. So for the seminar, each speaker will take up their turn providing a summary of their efforts, and that will be approximately 20 minutes per speaker, and then at the end we will have a Q&A. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Darcy Gordon. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Lourdes, and thanks everyone for being here. So today, as Lourdes mentioned, I'll be discussing the application of, specific strategies that come from the learning sciences to demonstrate possible ways of integrating evidence-based principles into instruction. So this is a scientific approach to teaching, and it really benefits both students and instructors. However, I'm not going to be really addressing the reasons why you might want to do this. I assume since you're here and listening and engaged, you're all invested and want to implement it. So I will, however, describe how learning science principles can be applied to instruction through a case study in 705, which is general biochemistry. So a little footnote, although the applications I'll describe are digital in nature, they certainly don't have to be. Most of the strategies I'll talk about can be implemented without additional use of technology. And I'll point out what I mean by that as I go along. And I also want to emphasize that incorporating evidence-based principles does not have to be all or nothing or all at once. So what I'll share with you today is just a subset of what is possible, and it also was implemented incrementally over several semesters. So just keep that in mind, that there will be a number of strategies presented, but you could certainly pick and choose and mix and match. So my presentation is structured to have kind of a repetitive format through which I'll present a series of strategies that incorporate the learning sciences. So this will start by stating the faculty and student needs, and these certainly do overlap. I'll describe course assets that were developed to meet these needs, and the learning science principles that were applied to these assets and in their creation. And finally, I'll also share survey data and usage data from the spring of 2019 semesters, with the caveat that only 20% of students in the about 150, 160 person class responded to the survey, but the usage data should be holding for all students. So some context about the subject. So biochemistry is a foundational subject for biology and a requirement for undergraduates to apply to medical school. It's also very important in biotechnology. We did a survey of our contacts in the biotechnology industry, and they've reported that academic knowledge of biochemistry is used in their everyday jobs. There's also no open courseware resources for 705 biochemistry, which indicated a clear need for supplemental materials. But the most important aspect of this project is that we had a collaborative and willing faculty member who really wanted to incorporate more evidence-based principles and digital tools into his course. And I'm talking about Professor Michael Yaffe. He teaches 705 biochemistry in a kind of team-taught manner. So he tackles the first half of this subject, and it's that first half of general biochemistry that this project pertains to. So the very first need that was articulated by Professor Yaffe to us was that he really wanted students to understand the real-life applications of biochemistry. So to meet that need in part, we developed a molecular visualization assignments and demonstrations. So we have students use an open source molecular visualization software called PyMol, and this is used by structural biochemists in their research. And we have students use it to answer questions about protein and nucleic acid structure and function. So an example of one of the assignments we developed is shown here along with a screenshot of the PyMol exercise necessary to answer the question. These PyMol assignments introduce how specific concepts and skills are used in real-life contexts by biochemistry scientists in their research. And this is with the intention of fostering interest among students by giving them insight into the application of the material that they're learning in class. As I mentioned before, though, this did not happen overnight. So we began incorporating this molecular visualization activities with one pilot assignment in 2016. In 2017, we expanded to 7 weekly assignments that were part of their graded problem sets. And in 2018, we added in-class demonstrations with students being provided 3D glasses for an optimal viewing experience. PyMol has a fun feature that you can toggle on and off that gives you like a 3D kind of visual. And we currently continue this strategy of coupling demonstrations with assignments. So I want to show a brief clip of this PyMol demonstration.
If we look at the deoxy form, that's this. And I'd like you to notice, if you can, that heme iron is a little puckered. It's not quite in the plane of the ring.
Okay, fun stuff. So these molecular visualization activities are examples of authentic learning experiences, which connects educational materials to real-life applications. So authentic learning experiences have many qualities that are described in the literature, some of which are really readily apparent on how they apply to these molecular visualization activities, which I've highlighted here. And the effects of using authentic learning activities are that it fosters a really deep understanding of the material. And it also helps students see that they can master the same skills that scientists use in the field. And together, those two effects can also promote persistence in both the subject, the course, and in the discipline at large. So we conducted a survey that I mentioned before, and the results indicated overall students really enjoyed these demonstrations. They thought the demonstrations should continue in subsequent years. And they also believe that the assignments really help them understand structural biochemistry better. It's also worth noting that the majority of students had never used PyMol before 705, and about half of the responding students indicated that they continued to use PyMol in subsequent courses after the introduction of it in 705. So this is really a skill that persists and is applicable in their undergraduate research, perhaps, and in other courses. So another need that was shared by both faculty and students is that students should really be aware of their expectations of learning for them and what material is emphasized. So to meet this need, we developed an articulated learning goals and objectives. So we post these learning goals and objectives for every lecture topic, one of which is shown here for the hemoglobin and allosteric unit. So goals are these 1 or 2 big picture takeaways, followed by about like 5 to 8 objectives that are itemized, concrete, and most importantly, measurable. So you want to describe these objectives in ways that can be quantified, whether or not the students achieved that objective. And as I promised, these don't have to be digital. You can write this on the board before class, or if you really plan ahead, you can include it in a syllabus. So using goals and objectives are examples of behavioral objectives and alignment. So behavioral objectives are pre-instructional strategies that organize and operationalize the expectations for learning by explicitly communicating what students should be able to do at the end of each class. Goals and objectives not only help the students, but they also help faculty maintain focus in organizing and developing the rest of their course. And that process of organizing and developing things around specified goals and objectives is called alignment. So alignment is this process in which the outcomes, assessments, and instructional content and strategies are all made cohesive. And it really structures the answer to the question, what should be taught? So by ensuring that assessments test the knowledge and skills that were desired, and the instructor actually teaches what is tested, learning gains are really substantial despite needing very little intervention. So this kind of intervention can happen at the very start of a course, before the course even begins. And I just want to go back one slide to remind you that all the examples of these resources that I'm going to be showing today align to this particular objective. And I selected this objective to really emphasize this alignment process. So you'll see a number of course assets that I'll use, even the primal activities that I showed before this, all map to this one objective about summarizing structural changes that occur from deoxygenated to oxygenated states of hemoglobin. So we helped develop over 100 learning objectives in this first half of the course. And about 2/3 of students indicated that they used them to study, despite the professor never actually indicating to students these are helpful study tools. And in a previous semester, the faculty kind of forgot to tell them that this was posted on MITx. So students were seeking these materials out, they were using them to study, and they found them useful to do that. And so I think this is really indicative of the utility of using these goals and objectives to help organize and set expectations. So the next shared need that we developed addressed was that students should be able to connect material across topics and have those connections reflected in their notes. And so we developed image handouts. So image handouts were generated for each class, and they contained a series of images in a digital handout. Again, this doesn't have to be digital, but it certainly made our lives easier. And together, they visually summarized the important concepts covered in each class, and they were made available, importantly, before the class took place. So the images included in these handouts, such as this one here, again, that maps to that structural change in hemoglobin, were designed to prompt thinking about how images and these concept questions that were beneath them are related. So there were no formal assessments associated with the concept questions associated with the images, but that does not mean, and I'll tell you in a moment why, that they were not useful. So these image handouts are, again, examples of a pre-instructional strategy called an advanced organizer and a technique called self-explanation. So advanced organizers are a strategy that function to integrate new and complex material into a student's existing knowledge base by offering a preview of the new material to come, organizing their thoughts and notes, helping make explicit connections across these different concepts, and promoting attentiveness in class because the students know what's coming and they're not struggling to draw down an intense diagram of hemoglobin shifting shapes when oxygen binds. And although the questions included on the handouts are not assessed formally, they encourage self-explanation, which is when a student explains or answers a question in their own words. And this practice can help promote a deeper understanding of the material and also awareness of a student's own knowledge gaps and understanding. So it promotes this metacognitive process of knowing what they know and knowing what they don't know. And there are over 100 images that we developed for inclusion in these image handouts in just the first half of the course. And students reported finding these resources really useful for studying, and again, for cutting back on time during class because they didn't have to draw everything. And quite frankly, some things are really difficult to draw, like 3D structures of proteins. So you may be familiar, if you've ever taught a course, that students will voice time and time again, will this be videotaped? They want to review the lectures at their own pace. They want to go back and see what exactly the words you used. And so to meet this need, we made videos available to them. So as part of a related project, we filmed all of Professor Yaffe's classes in 2018 and edited the resulting 25 hours of video. We broke each kind of lecture into segments of 2 to 10 minutes in length, and then added animations where it was appropriate. So then the following year in 2019, we released the corresponding video segments 24 hours after lecture had taken place. So this was not a substitute for students going to class, it was really a supplement. And also there's of course the caveat that subject matters can change time to time, different things are emphasized. So students should definitely use this as a review and as a supplement and not as a substitute. So here's a clip of one such video with an animation that aligns again to the objective I showed earlier.
By dropping this iron into the ring and pulling down the F8 helix, that makes one dimer preferentially rotate with respect to the other dimer.
And these supplementary videos represent some best practices in content delivery, as well as adhering to multimedia learning theory. So for example, there's evidence that students prefer when faculty write on the board over slides. The pace is more accessible, it's streamlined, and offers more opportunity for interaction. Videos that contain information presented in an organic conversational tone is also more engaging. And the animations that I designed use color, text, and movement in very prescribed ways to reduce unnecessary and competing demands on attention, also known as extraneous cognitive load. So there are 222 video segments, a nice number, in the MITx site that corresponds to this first half of the course. And on average, each video was viewed about 32 times, and students overwhelmingly found these useful. Students also want opportunities in applying what they learn. To address this need, we developed a series of formative assessments. And just as a reminder, a formative assessment helps students construct their understanding during the learning process, rather than judge at the end whether or not learning occurred. And so we offered 2 types of formative assessments: test yourselves and practice problem sets. So in the structure of the MITx site, test yourself questions follow each video segment. And we designed these to build basic conceptual understanding and check that students know the material that was contained in the associated video. All of these questions have immediate feedback that is graded without delay, even though they are not count towards the student's grade in the course. And progress or correctness is indicated by a green check or a red X. And after some amount of attempts or by getting the answer right, we have a show answer button that then displays an explanation at the bottom that really goes through what the reasoning was to get this correct answer. So we designed all these test yourself questions to provide immediate and elaborated feedback to students. By receiving feedback on the correctness of a submission immediately, shown by the green check or the red X, students can adjust their efforts in answering in subsequent attempts. The elaborated feedback we provide is very specific and detailed and gives an opportunity to learn more about the correct answer, why other answers are incorrect, and the steps of how to solve a specific problem. Feedback ultimately helps students plan, monitor, and reflect on their learning strategies. And also by examining where students need feedback, you as the instructor can gauge how students are performing and what their sticking points are. And feedback doesn't have to be digital. Certainly the timing would change, but the elaboration can remain the same. And the other type of formative assessments we offered were called practice problem sets. And I'm going to kind of quickly go through this next one because I'm running short on time. These questions are situated in a larger narrative that are about engaging biochemistry in research, where we injected the student as a participant and as a character in the story. The problem sets contain a series of questions that are conceptually related and often build off one another in sequence. So for example, if we wanted students to make broad biochemical interpretations about cooperativity based on differences between hemoglobin variants, that's a complex task that requires many steps. So we broke it down incrementally, step by step by step by step by step. So students could really piece together their knowledge into solving this larger picture problem. And so these practices are examples of narrative structures and scaffolding. So by transforming a problem set into a story that the student is a part of, it can be more enjoyable and engaging. And by breaking down a complex task by what's called scaffolding, students can receive more feedback. It focuses them on the demands of each component part. And ideally, by scaffolding and formative assessments, you train students how to approach these multi-component complex problems. So then when they are faced with another one that's perhaps not scaffolded, they can transfer that process to it and more readily understand how to approach the question. And again, those don't have to be digital either. This can apply to any written piece set or anything else. Both types of formative assessments, and ideally all assessments, are created with Bloom's taxonomy in mind. This is a way of classifying the skills and objectives that are tested by each of our assessments. And the test yourselves fall lower on this hierarchy of complexity, whereas the problem set questions fall higher. And also, how we structure these formative assessments is an example of retrieval practice. So essentially, retrieval practices really rely on the testing effect. This is where repeatedly accessing learned material over and over again results in increased long-term memory formation. So since the learning objectives tested in the test yourself questions are repeated and recombined in the practice problem sets, we implement both spaced retrieval, where students have a temporal interval in between testing, and interleaving, where different objectives are intermixed during the testing events. Together, over 500 assessments were developed for this project, including the PIMAL assessments, test yourselves, and practice problem sets. And again, students found these really useful, and they utilized them. About each question had an average of 4850 submissions. Okay, so to get to the punchline, I've talked about how students use and perceive the use of these supplemental resources, but I want to take one more moment to share another response. And that is almost all of the students that respond to our survey say that these supplemental resources reduce their stress associated with taking biochemistry. This is really significant considering how much stress MIT students report feeling. And so we see these materials as contributing to their overall well-being and to the holistic experience at MIT. So to briefly summarize, we address the needs of students and faculty with supplemental resources in an incremental and iterative process. And these resources do not need to be digital, although ours were. We created evidence-based course resources using the research on learning, such as alignment, self-explanation, feedback, etc. And the majority of students responding to our survey found all of these resources useful and reported that they reduced their stress. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention and for being here, and I will turn it over to Professor Gore.
So my name is Jeff Gore. I am in the Department of Physics here. And I'm, I guess, speaking as really as a colleague rather than as an education researcher. So I really appreciate that I was able to come after Darcy, because Darcy explained how things work, and but I would say that from my standpoint, so I'm a professor in the physics department, and I care about teaching, but I don't necessarily, I'm not doing certainly no original research, and also no original thinking. So from my standpoint, I guess I've been very influenced by the community of researchers that do think deeply about teaching. And I really think that this is an important aspect. It's not that we really want some people to be experts on the theory and application of teaching and learning, but then we also want to have other people that are like me that are receptive to the ideas that are coming out of that field. From I guess my exposure is relatively limited to the research. I did spend a few months at the National Academies with the Board on Science Education between my PhD and my postdoc. Right, so it's sort of science education. Well, in general, it's a science policy internship program, but I was in particular doing science education. And it was really during that time that I became, I guess, really convinced about a lot of the results coming out of the education research field. And I think it has really significantly impacted what I do in the classroom. Okay. All right, so what I want to do today is give some of my personal perspective on how that research has influenced what I actually do in my classroom, in particular within the context of this class, systems biology. One of the challenges in this class is that there's just a huge range of different backgrounds of students. Right, so it might be that 2/3 or 3/5 of the students are graduate students, the remainder are undergraduate. They're split across physics, biology, biological engineering, chemistry, math, many, many different departments. Right? And so what that means is that there really is a wide range of different levels of comfort around the biology or the mathematics, the programming, and that's it's a significant issue right, when you're in front of a classroom trying to bring everybody along. Right? And in particular, I think that this range of different backgrounds makes it especially important to think about how is it that you can make everybody feel as interested and comfortable in participating in the classroom and engaging with the material. All right, so yeah, this is just the starting point that I think there is a major issue that the traditional lecture is prone to get us a little bit sleepy, and it's not just the students that experiences this, right? 4 o'clock, it's the physics colloquium. Some days I go there and it's tough, right? So it's and this affects all of us. Right? And I think that part of the challenge, or maybe one of the issues, is that the traditional lecture has changed very little over the last 800 years. This is a wood block, from nice height. Could we get these sorts of things installed here at MIT? Maybe we could get up up high, and right. And so what you see here is there's the lecturer who's basically reading from this book to the group of students. And I think that there was a time where this maybe was the most effective way to, well, I don't know if it ever was, but you can imagine that it was a reasonable thing to do because maybe this book was just tremendously expensive and fragile, and so you couldn't let the students touch it, right? So then what you do is you read to them. But there's been a lot of changes in technology, and in particular, I don't know if you can quite see, Gutenberg, figured out how to, right? 500 years ago, we figured out how to make mass-produced books. So I think that we can take advantage of some of these things. Of course, more recently, there's other technology that have influenced things. But I guess what I want to highlight is that often there are many even low-tech solutions to persistent, I think, challenges that we're facing in the classroom. And often we're not even incorporating those low-tech solutions. All right, so I think one goal of this kind of active learning classroom is to try to get more students deeply engaged with the material. And this is a combination of what we are doing in front of the classroom as well as some of the physical spaces. This is a photo from a furniture manufacturer. I think it was Steelcase or something like that. Right, so of course, they're heavily stressing the physical structure of the classroom. And one of the things that I would say is that I really do believe that there's a lot that we can do to get more members of the class engaged in the material that's independent of the physical structure of the classroom. In particular, I actually quite like classrooms like this, where you can still do an awful lot of the same things that you might imagine taking place in a classroom like you see here. All right, so just a few things that I want to kind of hit on. One of the things that I strongly believe is that it's a unique opportunity when we are physically together in a classroom, and I think it's great if we can take advantage of that. It doesn't necessarily have to be just a free-for-all discussion. I think that structured discussions are often much better, but I think that it is good to take advantage of being in the same space physically and temporally. And part of the way that we do that is that we try to get some of the base level understanding done before the class. So we have pre-class reading and questions just so that the students have thought about the material a bit before they arrive. And that means that the discussions can be more interesting, right? And during the classroom time, I think that a major challenge is just how to get all of the students to engage with the material. I think a real issue, I think in many classrooms, is that it's the instructor with 50 students, and there's a dialogue that's going on between the instructor and one student that is really rich and great, but then it's really just, then you have the one-on-one, Aristotelian kind of experience with, with one student, but you'd like to get more students involved, right? And I really have found these concept questions to be a nice way of doing that. And then in particular, after that, it provides a nice framework to do this think, pair, share, right? So there's the question together with, thinking about it, and then pairing off and discussing, and then sharing maybe with the broader group. Okay, so in terms of, and I guess I'm a very practical person. So I always like to know what is it that people are actually doing in their classrooms, why are they doing it, and and how are they doing it. Right. So in these pre-class reading questions, it's really it's a simple thing. The idea is that the class time is valuable, so we want to do the things that are not required to do in the classroom. Ideally, we are doing outside of it. And the idea of the questions is that it's not meant to be a high-stress thing. It's really just a way of encouraging the students to do some of the reading and thinking before the class, right? So, and in particular, the way that we often do this is it's like maybe 5% of the grade in the class is based on participation and on filling out those questions before class, right? So it's not for correctness or anything like that. It's really just a way of encouraging ourselves to do it. And, I often view my role as the instructor as sort of like a personal trainer, right? That the student wants to, become, fit, mentally or something, right? But, there are competing demands. And it's always the case that the night before, we're busy, and, there's always other, there's the new TV show that just came out, right? So, and I'm subject to the same things as everyone else. So I think a bit of a nudge to get us to do things is needed by all of us, right? And so this is really just a way of saying, all right, we expect you to do the reading and think about the reading before class. And I think that, and the participation rates are really reasonable. And I think the other thing that I really like about these pre-class questions is it does strengthen the feedback loop between the instructor and the students. Right? It's often, and that's part of what's also good about these concept questions, but it's often the case that, that I give a description of something that I think is amazing, right? But then it turns out that none of the students understood what I was talking about, right? That means that maybe it wasn't as good of an explanation as I thought, but it's good that I knew. It's good that I find that out. Otherwise, I use that that original amazing explanation to give another amazing explanation for something else, and but pretty soon we're just talking about totally different things. Right. So on the practical level, the kinds of things, the way that we actually implement this in a lot of my classes is just through a Google form. Right. So this is you just send out a link, and then the students just click on it, and then they can write their response. And at the end of the day, you get it as a spreadsheet or whatnot, right? So for example, I looked up a recent question. The question is, all right, so this is about life at low Reynolds number for the physical forces that are experienced by small living things like bacteria. And one of the questions based on the reading is, why is it surprising that the drag experienced by a small object scales linearly with the radius? Right, the radius of the object. Okay. And right, so this is, it's just there's an answer in the reading. And of course you could just say, oh, how does the drag scale with the radius? But that's a less interesting question because then it's really just you can just copy paste. Whereas if you ask, well, why is it surprising? Then you say, well, what's the alternative and what might I have thought before? Right. So it's in terms of Bloom's hierarchy. when you put up that chart, I wanted to figure out where this question would fall. I think it's not on the lowest one, but I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure how far up I got on it. But I think it is a more interesting question. Right, and why is it surprising? Well, the reason that it's surprising is because for all of us, if you imagine you're skydiving, then the drag that you experience from going through the air goes as your surface area. Right? So that's why if you can really strongly influence the speed, the terminal velocity, depending on whether you're doing this or diving. And that's why in these action movies, when somebody falls out of the plane without their parachute, then the hero can dive and get down there and grab, right? Okay. So so in our normal lives, the drag it scales as the surface area, so that goes as the square of our radius or our size. Okay. Whereas for small objects, the drag only increases linearly. Okay. So it's a different, and it's a scaling behavior, so it leads to very different. It's a very different world that bacteria experience as compared to us. Okay. Right. So that's so this is the explanation. It's surprising because you might expect that it's going to go as the square because that's telling you about how many molecules you're hitting or something as you're going. Right? The way that we normally do this is that we return these answers the night before. Right? So they're due, in many cases, like 10 o'clock, and then we give the responses back that night. We typically choose answers from among the answers that were submitted by the students. That's assuming that one of the answers seems reasonable. So that way, but it's also just kind of a nice, like, oh yeah, I explained this thing sufficiently well that the instructors chose it to send back to the class. It's unattributed, but but I think that students enjoy that. And also, it is it's a bit of a pain for us as well as it is for the students. And but that does mean that there's a bit of a buy-in because they know that it's kind of a pain for us to be doing this as well as it is for them to be answering. And so typically it's maybe something like a 30-minute reading with 3 questions that can be answered in 1 sentence. And if you understood the reading, then it's very, very quick. So it's not meant to be calculations or anything. It's really just to get you to think about the material. But in addition to those 3 questions, we always include a 4th, which is an optional question, but just asking, what is it that you found confusing or surprising about either the reading or about the previous lecture? Right? And I would say that we get the responses here. It might be a quarter of the students respond to this one, and the responses are split roughly equally between the reading and the lecture. And I think that this is great because if you just ask the students to send you an email or fill out a form about something that they were confused about on the lecture, like the number of responses you get is like 0, 0, 0. Right? Whereas here they're already on the form, and since they're there, then they're like, oh yeah, there was something I was confused about, and so then they'll write it. And then depending on the response, you can either email it back together with the other answers, or you can address it in the next lecture, or you can respond individually. All right, so coming back to, I know there was something about relevance, or all right. So okay, so now that we've done this reading life at low Reynolds number, now you can start thinking about things that are out there in the world. So it turns out that this is a photo of something called marine snow. All right, and if it were a video, then you'd be able to, as you imagine, it's going to look like snow, right? But it's basically they're detritus or carbon particles of various sorts from dead crabs and other things. But it's basically carbon food of some sort or another that's sinking in the ocean. And then it's going to be consumed by bacteria and other things. And actually, this sort of carbon cycling is a big part of what determines carbon fluxes actually across the entire planet. Okay, so there's a lot of questions about, all right, how rapidly are these things eaten? How rapidly are they sinking? Okay, well, the sinking thing, well, we can actually think about that, right? Because we've already, we recently just read, okay, that the drag of a particle increases linearly with its size. Okay, now you can say, well, what's going to be the speed at which these marine snow particles are going to settle in the ocean? Because if they settle rapidly before they can get consumed, then they're going to reach all the way down to the bottom of the ocean, and then they may not be cycled. Right? So you can think about, all right, well, if you double, let's say you have a sphere and you double the radius of the particle, how much is that going to increase the speed at which it sinks? All right, so, all right, well, you guys are not in the class and you didn't do the reading, but you can still maybe ruminate on it and guess how much it's going to increase. But this gets us back to the concept questions. All right, you don't have to do a real answer, but you can participate just so you know what it's like to be a student. Right? So one of the things that there's a lot of technology that has been used in these classrooms that I think can be really nice, particularly the clickers, to facilitate these sorts of questions. But one of the things that I've found is that in many cases, I don't want to store the information, and I don't want to grade it in a lot of ways. I really just want the students I want a dialogue with the students where all the students are participating. Right? I think a major issue in a lot of normal classes if you just go in front of the class and you say, oh, how much is this going to increase by? Then what's going to happen is, one or maybe two students are going to raise their hands. Right? They're going to have an opinion about it. And then again, you talk to them, and it's a great discussion. But the problem is that those were the only two students in the classroom that were even thinking about the problem. Right? Because I think it's really the case that if you're not going to have to report back in any way, you're not going to raise your hand, even if you get the answer, right? But then it just makes you feel like, well, why should I do it at all, right? And so I think that the problem with a lot of classroom discussions is that they're not structured, and what it means is that it's really a one-on-one discussion between the instructor and the one student that is really into it. And so in terms of this issue of generating a more inclusive classroom, I think it's really essential to do something that gets everybody to participate in the process. And what I like about these concept questions in particular, using either cards or voting, is that it's a nice physical thing. There's no problems with technology, communication, the internet going down, whatever it is. But also, it's a nice opportunity to just have a little dialogue between you and each student, right? Because you go up there and they vote, and you can see how they feel. They're kind of like, or they're feeling really good about it, or they might say, oh, it's either 2 or 3, right? And so and you can see this across the entire room, and I find it to be fun. All right, so you can't do the problem, but just as what do you think? How much do you think it would increase by? Right. So the normal thing that what we do is I'll say, oh, do you need more time? And the idea is that students will either say nod or they'll shake their heads. And since we're going to run out of time, we're shaking our heads. All right. So then what I do is I ask the students to vote just by together. So I normally say, okay, we'll vote together. So you have 1 through 5 in front. Are you guys ready? Just do something so that you feel like you're. All right. Ready? 3, 2, 1. All right. So we got some 2s, 3. All right. Okay. So right. And then but then often what we'll do is we'll have the students after doing a vote like this. We'll often have them pair off if say the number of correct answers is between say 30 to 75% or so, then you might have the students pair off and discuss. Right? Because if everybody already gets it right, then there's no point in spending the time. But if there's significant disagreement, then maybe it's nice to pair off and discuss the answers. And then often you can have the students revote. So that's often what we do, and I quite like it. All right, so it turns out in this case it was actually increasing by a factor of 4. Okay, and that was because if you double the radius, then you increase the mass by a factor of 2 to the third is 8, but then the drag is a factor of 2, so then you get back to. So this is a different scaling than what you get for if you're skydiving. Right? All right, and and at the end of the day, it's about equalizing the drag force and the gravitational force above the buoyancy force, right? But it doesn't matter, but just as a sense of how it works. Okay, so we'll quit. Yeah, I guess I've really been I've been impressed by a lot of the research that has come out of the education research field. When I was first exposed to it as a graduate student, I was a little bit skeptical, but that's just my personality. So I heard the student-centered learning, active learning. You have to engage with it. And it just sounds like the kind of thing that somebody would say. But so it's just my natural skeptical personality. But then then I spent these few months, and I really I read a lot of the papers, and I was and I was really convinced that we have been collectively making a lot of mistakes in the way that we lead our classroom. So it's had a big effect on what I do. And as Darcy mentioned, there's something about frequent questions with rapid feedback that I think is it's one of the strongest signals that comes back in a lot of these education studies that you need to engage with the material, you need to make some guess or put something out there, and then you need to find out whether it was correct or not. And I think that we often make a lot of mistakes at each one of these steps in the process. And with that, I think I will quit, and thank you for inviting me. Yeah.
So I can pass around the mic if anyone has a question for our presenters.
This is for Jeff. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So I'm curious. I know you're not doing any educational research, but anecdotally, can you share some of your experiences, either in terms of engagement or performance or both, after implementing some of these strategies in your classroom?
So we have not done what I would consider like a proper study, right? In particular, we have not done the pre-post kind of thing that with questions that have really been validated in the way that like the education research community would like. But I would say that the feedback from student evaluations has been typically positive, and that and I would say that especially as I've gotten more used to the dynamic of the classroom and how to implement these things, I'd say I think there is a real feeling that more of the students are more involved than would be the case otherwise. Yeah.
Both of you talked about, well, Darcy, you explicitly talked about the iterative process that you use to implement these changes in 705. And Jeff, I'm guessing, or would you be willing to share some of your growing pains from starting out as a brand new faculty member till now, and sort of reflecting back, like what would have helped you sort of, so you had this sort of unique case of being in the science education policy world for a few months. If you were to remove that, what do you think would have helped you like kind of get over that activation barrier starting out?
Do you want to start? Do you want me to start? All right. Yeah. So I guess a few things. One thing that Darcy said is that you don't have to go whole hog into the thing, and I think that that's part of what keeps a lot of faculty from doing anything. Right? There's a sense that if you're going to incorporate any aspect of any lessons from the education and research field, that you have to go take off a 6-month sabbatical and learn everything, and then make sure that you're doing the perfect, and I think that that's just asking too much of faculty. But I do think that that's part of what I like about just the concrete aspect of what is it that I do, how do I do it? Because it just highlights that a lot of it doesn't require a whole lot of effort in the sense of the concept questions. You just have to make sure that you ask something that is kind of there could be some confusion about, but that is addressing a core issue. In terms of one of the things that I think I've kind of learned is that the dynamic between the instructor and the class I think is a little bit tricky. I tend to be a very consensual decision maker, meaning that if I'm thinking about a change, I'll go to the class and say, I was thinking about doing this. What do you think? And then I try to get it's good to get feedback, but then it can be paralyzing as well. I was really influenced by, I guess, Ed Prather, I think it was, who led a teaching class at the I took the AAPT, the American Association of Physics Teachers. There's a retreat for new faculty, down in DC. I went there, and one of the things that Ed did was he kind of led us through a sample mini lecture of his intro astronomy course, and he incorporated a lot of these things with the flashcards, which I had never thought of. And I was just amazed at how interesting I found it. But also, he is up there, and he is just complete control of the room. Maybe even too much. But it was also just maybe a nice corrective for me, where it's like, it's my classroom. This is I've thought a lot about it. This is the way we're going to do things. And you can still get feedback and think about it. But I think there is something about taking ownership of the classroom that I was maybe not doing.
I would also caution folks against getting discouraged really quickly, because you're trying something new. You have to kind of work out the kinks. And so say you tried a new strategy and it didn't quite go the way you thought it would go. Don't say that strategy is crap and I'm not going to do that again. A lot of us are scientists. That's an N of 1. Like, repeat the experiment, try again. And, that iterative and slightly tweaking and monitoring and adjusting is really, I think, also critical.
Jeff, you mentioned using using the question, what did you find confusing or surprising, as the sort of third question or the last optional question. And I know Eric Mazur's at Harvard, his work showed that there was an inverse correlation between students that got the first two questions right and students who said, no, nothing was confusing or surprising. Oh. And I wondered if you had made any observations about that.
Okay, but I want to make sure, an inverse correlation meaning that the students who got the first initial questions correct, they did not.
They often would say, "Oh yeah, I was really confused by X, Y, or Z," and students that got it wrong would say, "No, nothing was surprising or confusing."
All right. Okay, so that's super interesting. I have not actually tried to. I think the nature of our data, often they're responding to a different confusing thing. So it's not even about. I do think that part of our goals as individuals and as instructors is to try to encourage an accurate view of our own level of knowledge about the world. And I recently was impressed by one of these IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. They have these reports come out every 4 or 5 years, and and it's in English, right? They say, it's likely that this, very likely that. They actually in one of them they had a chart that told you what each of those words meant in terms of probabilities. Right? So they actually said, more likely than not is like 50 to 70%. Likely is 70 to 85. Very likely is 85 to 95. So I've proposed to my research group that we should institute this IPCC standard in the lab, right? Because sometimes somebody says something and they say, it's certain that this thing is, and I was like, you don't even believe it, right? why are you saying that? So I do think that there is something about internal like self-awareness that is. That we could all improve on, but I think it's something to think about. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question for Darcy. It's about objective setting.
Yeah.
So I frequently struggle setting objectives to be measurable because sometimes I feel like I'm making them arbitrarily measurable because I know you're supposed to be able to measure them, but sometimes I feel like it doesn't align with what I'm trying to do in class. And I was wondering if you had any advice or good questions to ask yourself when you're trying to do that.
That's excellent. Yeah. So I think a strategy often is, you're setting your objectives and then ask yourself, what would an assessment look like that would address this objective? And sometimes it's really easy, and sometimes it's like, well, that's just one question that I could write that would test that objective. But that objective only covers one question. So there's like a back and forth mapping. So you want to make sure you have something that is measurable, but maybe encompasses a little bit wider range than calculate the Hill coefficient. Certainly if that's a big part of your course, you definitely want to have it on there. But maybe something like, describe cooperativity in a mathematical way, or something that you could then address through several different objectively measurable questions. But it is challenging. I think the more you do it, the easier it becomes, and there's always room to grow. And there are some really helpful resources out there that give verbs that tend to go along with Bloom's taxonomy levels. And so you can also check yourself against, okay, so I'm asking a lot of things to describe, but not a lot to analyze. Maybe I should shake it up and think about what I'm actually asking the students to learn. So I think it's good to keep in mind also the difficulty level.
In the interest of time, we'll stop taking questions. That is actually behind a little bit. But maybe if you can stick around for a few more minutes, folks can come down and ask questions. I just wanted to announce the next speaker, who is Becky Wei Ling Packer. She's a professor in the Department of Psychology and Education at Mount Holyoke, and she's going to talk about research-based practical strategies to improve your day-to-day mentoring with a specific emphasis on constructive feedback. She's done a lot of work on first-generation low income and supporting historically underrepresented students. She will be coming on the 29th of October. So be on the lookout for announcements so that you can participate. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you to our speakers.